I don't know. I'll
Just
have
your computer's cocksucker.
no. It's gonna be in some trouble soon enough here. Like it's a old AMD crap back when they weren't the most stable of GPUs and CPUs. So
I think their CPUs are
no, it's gonna be in
usable.
some
Their
trouble
GPUs
soon
are
enough here.
still crap, driver wise at least.
What about heating your house wise?
No, that's Nvidia's fucking new dream.
So
Also,
that's
make
what
you go
I'm looking for in
completely
a
broke on
computer.
energy prices. Hey, you
They're
need
gonna have to
450 watts
release.
for a goddamn card. It's like
Yeah,
Jesus,
but
There's
my
think of the
entire
savings.
system pulls 450 watts.
Well,
Not for one
they're
card.
speculating that they might bundle um, power supplies with the high end cards
If they
that can
charge like
actually.
a reasonable price for the bundle, then fine. But still, I don't want to be paying, especially since I'm on LNG for power. It's a little pain in the ass.
Also, most people have like rooms that are not fucking triple AC'd.
It's true.
Like, I don't know if you've ever ran your card like full out in a confined space or semi confined space without good ventilation. You're just gonna get boned no matter how. Like, it's just not comfortable. Like, I remember having my computer in like a den, like a small den area, and it was like honestly 3 to 5 degrees hotter than the ambient air temperature in the rest of the house.
Oh
The
yeah, I
window
remember
open.
that little den. That would have turned into because you didn't have a window there, right?
There was a window. It's just like it didn't have proper like frost breeze or anything. It's like
Yeah,
I don't know. Lots of people will actually care about that because they don't have a.
yeah. If you don't have like a good AC system, you're gonna swelter in your room.
Yeah, they just like they're gonna have to put their computer somewhere suboptimal. They don't have.
If it's if you spend virtually all your time in winter, might not be a bad thing, but even in good old Canada, it gets real hot up here. So, all right, do we want to just dive right into the topic?
As well.
All right, so today we're covering the issue of demographics. So, I think a lot of people would be familiar with the idea that we're having a population crisis, but I think most people misconstrue it as or think it's the old one from like the 1950s that we're going to have way too many people and we're all going to starve to death because the population has hit such a massive a number that we'll never be able to feed everybody. But when you actually dive into the real numbers, it's looking like that's actually going to be the opposite problem. So the basic issue is as nations urbanize and as they develop, they start or they slow down in having children. Fertility rates drop, and people, I think, are generally kind of aware that a place like Canada and some others might be a bit lower in natural birth rates, but they don't. I don't think they grok the fact that overall that's actually like a standard trend across a huge portion of the world, including China, Japan, and basically every place except really at the moment most of Africa. But even those countries will eventually get there as well. So what we're covering right now is that topic of the pretty much they call it the demographic time bomb. Basically, the problem is like once a nation gets developed enough, they stop having children. So when you think about like in the good old days, prior to like mass urbanization and industrial revolution, most like virtually every society's population is going to look like a regular pyramid. Very few people in the older age brackets up on top with tons and tons of babies at the bottom. In many countries now, that's flipped. And that actually turns out to be a massive problem if it's too imbalanced, like if the inverted pyramid is way too inverted, meaning that there's a very few amount of kids and young adults, and then tons of elderly at the top. And the basic problem there is you have an aging population who is no longer going to contribute to the economy in a productive manner. Essentially, they're going to be, they're retired and they require quite a bit of investment from the society in terms of healthcare and that type of thing, while not producing as basically anything in most cases. And that's a big problem. It's fine if you have lots of people to replace them, but if you don't have like a big productive base underneath of them that can support the economy and support them in old age. And so that actually turns out to be, if you have a big enough of an inversion there, that turns out to be enough to potentially completely collapse a society, because you have massive amounts of resources that are not being produced, and your top part of the pyramid is drawing lots of resources. So it turns out to be a sleeper problem that is likely to actually be one of the biggest issues. And some people have been drawing attention to it. Jordan Peterson, Elon Musk has also been banging that drum, and a couple others as well that are
And doing his best to fight the problem.
Yeah, that's true. 9 kids, I think it's now. Jesus.
Yeah.
He's got the gene for twins and triplets, though. Like, he's had so many of them. It's actually wild. I digress. Enough about Elon. Anyways, that's kind of a basic summary of the problem, where, yeah, essentially, if you get that inverted pyramid, your country's in deep trouble. We can, if you guys want to dive maybe a little bit deeper into that, if you got anything else to add, and then we can kind of move on to, like, country by country basis, and then the implications for what it means for like a regular person in Canada or America. But yeah, give you guys.
I would just say, historically, the way the population demographic shakes out is you start off with a regular pyramid, and then you get medicine and nutrition and all that good stuff of the modern world, and people stop dying as frequently and start living longer. And then after you've had a few generations of that, you start having less kids. So Africa right now is kind of in that point where their lifespan is extending and they have more food and nutrition, but they're still having kids. But they're headed along the same path that Europe walked in the last century. And people seem to think that instead of taking generations, it might be like within a generation that they stop having kids.
Yeah, that's definitely probable, or at least somewhat likely.
Basically, they think it speeds up in the way they described it when the article I was reading is sort of an ideological contagion, with like the idea of you're an industrial nation, this is how you live, and the rest of the world's doing it, so it's faster for the places that aren't to catch up.
Yeah, as the West had kind of done that first, as they industrialized first, it took quite a bit longer to sort that out, or to have that pattern shake out, I suppose would be a better way of saying it. But now that other nations have like a bit of a template, it's faster. Definitely saw that with China, though it's a bit of a special case.
Well, and you also just have the technology to facilitate it faster. Like, you have birth control. Like,
yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
And yeah, exactly. The stuff that had been developed elsewhere can then just be easily shipped over to different nations, right? Like, it doesn't take 60 years to have something like an idea or a technology spread. It takes 6 months.
yeah, and it's multi-faceted, like why birth rates decline with like modern living. Essentially, like, you have urbanization, just kids become an opportunity cost rather than a resource of labor, and in like agrarian society. Like, if you go 200 years, 300 years ago, almost everyone's going to be farming, and children are just labor at that point, right? Like, they're just your labor source. And
rural enough right now.
Yeah.
Still the good old German clans from the diaspora getting their kids out there on the fields.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you can even look at like the Amish, right? Exactly, or whatever other religious sect that still does farming as their primary
Tons of
occupation. Yeah, it's free labor, and like in the urban setting, it's just an expense, especially. And I think that's accelerated with the knowledge economy, right? Because back in the day, good old day, you could send your 12-year-old to a factory and they could support themselves and support the family. Now you have to have like labor laws and rules and stuff, and kids don't become productive until they're
Well,
at
probably
least
into the 20s.
18ish. Yeah, now and with the knowledge economy, it's like a lot of kids don't become actually self-sufficient and productive until they're early or mid 20s, and you have to pay for a advanced education at a university in depending on which country you are, right?
I'd say in North America, at least, we're even hitting 30s before you're like a net positive, because it's now more common for kids under 30 to live with their parents than any other living situation.
That's true. Like it's extending decade by decade, and I think, like you guys were mentioning before, that's going to be, all those factors are going to be like kind of just copy and pasted into other regions much quicker, because they're going to urbanize much faster than Europe took 100 years or at least 50 years to like do a good chunk of their urbanization. China did it in 30. India is going to do it in 30, 40 years. Like, it just, all these processes are faster in the modern era for countries that haven't gone through them yet. I can't think of a single side of the coin that doesn't happen faster now than before. So Africa is going to accelerate through this process much quicker than any other country, other than maybe China, because of China's special circumstance of one-child policy and stuff. But it's going to be a lot faster than Europe or the US.
Yeah, so I think that kind of covers like the basic issue. So we can now move into some of the regions and just talk about where they're at. So, Hubbards, do you want to start off with Asia?
Yeah, like I was saying before, I guess in East Asia, you're going to have China as your primary population source. And China, there's like recent indications that their population is actually on pace to decline much quicker than even previously anticipated. And so the big takeaway from China, I think, is they're like the classic example of demographics and the economy interacting, where they had a huge population boom, and then they had the one-child policy instituted. And when that big demographic population hit working age, their economy grew like crazy, because they had a ton of productive aged population that they were able to import raw material, do a ton of value added labor, and export finished goods and make a ton of money. And now the median age in China, depending on which source you look at, is like in the 40s, mid 40s, which means that in the next decade or two, they're going to have a huge chunk of their current most productive employees and workers leave the workforce. And because of the one-child policy, like the generation after that is way, way smaller. There's just literally no people to replace them. And a lot of the jobs that you look at in China that powered their economic growth are kind of manufacturing type industrial jobs, and productivity for that actually peaks in like your middle age, so around 40 to 50, and declines as you get older. So China just doesn't really have, like, yes, you can raise the retirement age, you can try to keep older workers in the workforce. It's not going to do that much, because those people will just not be as productive as they were when they were younger. So you're just going to inevitably have a decline in productivity. And then presumably, if you don't take care of them, like you have to take care of them, the retirees. China's actually quite similar to the rest of East Asia, Japan and South Korea, oddly enough. Just because of their one-child policy, they kind of caught up with those countries in terms of demographic declines. Japan's like the first to the post on that. They peaked in like the late 80s, early 90s, and they've been declining ever since. And like just in 2021, they had a 600,000 loss in population decline, because their birth rates are low, obviously, and lots of deaths.
They have the effect of COVID in that.
I mean, COVID is a contributing factor because there's more deaths, but like excess deaths aren't like that much higher than as far as I remember, excess deaths from COVID weren't that high in Japan. So
that's what I thought it wasn't that bad.
Yeah, so their population is just like on a downward trajectory, like even before COVID, quite significant. And I mean that. Again, linking back to the economy is just obviously direct correlation with economic performance. Their economy peaked in the late 80s, early 90s, and it's been completely stagnant since. And now Korea's basically behind Japan, but they're like going even deeper into the depths than Japan. So they peaked in 2018, and their population actually started to decline in 2021, and their birth rates are even lower than Japan and expected to stay lower. So they're going to have like an even steeper, I guess, inverted pyramid than the Japanese. And their population is set to decline from about 51 million people, I believe, in 2021 to 37 million by 2070. So just like a huge, just absolute decline in population, on top of like the exact same type of worker problems where they just don't have anywhere near enough working age people to replace their workforce that is now, they're again a little bit behind China and Japan, but soon to leave the workforce.
That's pretty wild, like that level of decline by 2070. Like that is...
Yeah, like
that would just be so weird to live in a society where, you know, you're going to have all this infrastructure built and there's not going to be nearly as many people around. Like even just that, from that aspect, it would just be strange. Be so many like empty apartment buildings, and it would just be, it'd be such a bizarre...
Like I wonder if you'll just get ghost towns.
You probably would, especially because I think you would.
I guess like ghost cities.
Well, like, you know, people would probably start to clump, right? They'd notice that things are getting a little bit like less and less, like thinned out, right? And they'd probably start to clump into like tighter packs. So you'd probably just have. This is just me spitballing, obviously, but that would be my guess, is because human beings are kind of used to the city living now. They like the motion and whatnot. Unlike myself, like, I'd be perfectly fine if there's less traffic. But generally, I think people would be attracted to this, like to where the level of activity and the amount of people around is still high. And so I think people would drain out from particular areas that started to see thinning, and it would just be like a contraction into various areas. And then the areas that they left would just be, ghost towns. It'd be bizarre.
I know Korea already has a problem with Seoul attracting most of the population, and Japan had a similar problem with Tokyo, although Japan put a bunch of super high-speed rails in to try and alleviate that problem. But it definitely, like, your expectation seems to be in line with what's already happening.
Well, that's just kind of how
it's a bunch
operate.
A bunch of different implications, to be honest. Like, crazy, like Japan is, again, like they're a very interesting case because they're basically between 10 and 30 years ahead of the rest of the developed world, and then whatever that equates 70 years ahead of the developing world. And like housing, for example, had dropped 60% and has never recovered. And the stock market stagnated and has never recovered. So,
well, yeah, that's brutal on like if you're using those as your retirement, right? Like,
if anyone knows about stocks listening to this podcast, the best way to play the Japanese stock market was with 0.5% leverage, which is just bizarre. Like, you're better not to buy an index fund. You're better to buy. How does that work out? 4 shares or 2 shares of the index fund and a share of the inverse index fund, so that you had 0.5% of your cash exposed to the market.
Yeah, like, and again, like this was actually predicted by one demographer back in the 80s. Harry Dent predicted that Japan would basically crash, because it seems kind of weird now for people that weren't alive in that era. But if you go and look back at like the news cycle and news stories around that time, like Japan was predicted to overtake America economically as the biggest economy in the world. They were like, economists and business experts were saying, oh yeah, Japan, like their manufacturing capacity, their innovation, they're the best of the best of the best.
The world alive. It was kind of like the notion back
then.
then.
Yeah, they were projected to pass the United States. Like this was like, in our era, everyone thinks China, but in that era, it was like Japan was the golden economy that couldn't be touched, and they were going to pass the U.S. And several people, including Harry Dent, said basically, no, that's not going to happen because of demographics. They just don't have the workforce, the bodies, to continue to replicate the success they've seen over the last 30, 40 years into the 21st century. It's not going to happen. They're going to have big problems because of demographics. And lo and behold, exactly what he predicted came to pass in terms of the economy stagnating because of lack of labor. And it does seem interesting that economists do seem to, at least some schools of economics and a good chunk of mainstream economists, don't factor in long-term demographics, I think, as much as they should to their projections. And they don't. Yeah, I don't know if the models don't do it justice, or maybe it's getting better. But
one thing I found in researching this is that there are certainly economists who basically, when the issue of demographics gets brought up, they just hand wave it away by saying that technology and efficiency will improve to offset the smaller workforce, and then they just ignore it. Like that's why it's not in my model, because it won't actually end up mattering.
Yeah, and I think that's a big thing that people don't understand. I guess this is going a little bit far afield, but like money and the economy, the way that the economy is described is just it's not actually the reality. Money is just a abstraction of of information, our best guess at information in the economy.
Yeah, it's like an imperfect representation of what's actually going on.
Yeah, it's the map. It's not the territory. And I think that's where a lot of economic analysis gets lost, is like they get lost up in the map, and they, GDP has been tracking, 2% a year for the last, X number of years, blah, blah, blah. Like our projections on this, this factor of the model, it's like, it doesn't matter. None of those things matter if you don't actually have people to go and do work. Like it will fall apart. So I think that's like the biggest takeaway from the Asian region. They're like, surprisingly, China as well, through the one-child policy has accelerated them to the point where they're kind of like the leading trio in being, ahead on this pyramid, I guess, along with Europe in particular as well. But if we zoom out from East Asia and look at like South Asia and India, that's actually one of the regions that will continue to grow for the next good, South Asia probably 30 years, and India maybe 30 to, sorry, that kind of area is still growing. Yeah, so that area is still growing and is projected to grow for several more decades. And India in particular, they're bigger than the rest of Southeast Asia and the region combined, right? So they're the main driver, and they're projected to grow for like maybe 30 or 40 more years before they peak in terms of their population in the working and spending age. And that's the other thing, like productivity matters a lot, obviously, as labor, but there's issues with spending, and there's also issues with asset drawdowns in terms of selling off your assets, which we'll probably get to more later. But it's not just the fact that you lose your labor force when they age out. You also lose your consumer base.
Yeah.
So that's an important thing to note. But yeah, so India will be an interesting contrast to follow in the next 30, 40 years to East Asia, which is, well past the point of no return in terms of demographics. India is well suited to boom economically because of their demographics.
And so just to kind of clarify with China, like if you wanted to speak maybe a little bit more about that, just because they are a bit of a special case. And I think you were touching more on South Korea and Japan there. I think it'd be interesting to get a little bit more of a little bit more color to China's situation.
Well, I think again the Chinese situation is basically a few years, delayed of Japan, where their working force is aging out, and their big cohort of working age people is aging out. They don't have the replacement births, and that's official statistics show that. And if you go and look at like the more detailed, some of the analysis done by, there's a researcher that I'm gonna beyond butcher the name of. Yeah, Yi Fuxian. He's just this fanatic in the sense like he's works in the United States. He's a OBYGN or whatever, obstetrician, and he does a lot of independent research into the demographics, and he's written a couple books on it in China, and his projections have always been much more negative than the official. There's actually a data leak. There's a huge amount of data was compromised on Chinese citizens, and that leaked data included demographic information, and that demographic data was actually even worse than the Yi's estimates, basically. So they're even more pessimistic than his estimates. And like what they show is just brutal. Like one special problem in China is the gender imbalance, because the one-child policy was basically 3 decades. You can only have one child. Obviously, there was a huge number of selective abortions, mostly girls being selectively aborted in favor of men. So now in some areas of China, there's a 3-to-2 male to female ratio, 60% men, 40% women, in the age group that is growing up right now. So, and the births are also quite low. Like the official data is like 1.3. Like the fertility rate is 1.3 births per woman. You need obviously around 2.1 for replacement. And that's the official data. The leaked data is more like 1.1. So like a full birth short of replacement. So their population pyramid is just sharply inverted.
Yeah, it's a nice old V.
Yeah, and it's going to get, obviously, as that plays out over the next 30, 40, 50 years, they're going to wind up looking more like Japan, and maybe even worse than Japan, in the sense they're going to have a ton of people, elderly people, very few working age people, very few children, and they're going to be, in particular, in comparison to, say, Korea or Japan, even worse off because of the gender imbalance. It's like, there's just not going to be, there's going to be even less couples having children for the same amount of people in any given age group because of the gender imbalance. So that they are in a particularly bad situation because of that gender imbalance. And the Chinese government has already kind of pulled out some efforts to reverse it. They went to a 2-child policy in 2016, and then recently a 3-child policy. There was a tiny bump in 2016 like 2016, 2017 with the people who were presumably waiting for that to happen, having kids, but they've already gone back down. They've already, since 2016, gone back to declining birth rates. And the estimates from the leak data is actually that China is already in population decline. Like the official data was like thinking that the population decline would start in 2027, and that was like in line with UN. But the leak data is showing that China probably had a population decline in 2021, and they're like on pace. The number that from the leak data is they're on pace to have 600 million people by 2100, which so that's over a halving of their current population over the next 80 odd years, which is absolutely unprecedented in terms of demographics. So I mean that's another part of the problem with like these demographics is like there's no population that has really gone through such a dramatic demographic shift.
Yeah, this is all completely unprecedented, right? So we're not going to understand how it actually is going to play out in the slightest. But there's some predictions.
One really interesting thing with China is that they're pretty much the exemplar that nobody knows how to fix this problem, if you view it as a problem. Because if any country could deal with it, it should be a communist centralized state.
Yeah,
like they thought initially that upping the one-child policy to the two-child policy would just magically increase their fertility. Then didn't, so then they started bringing in some positive eugenics, like, giving money to mothers and giving paid leave from work for mothers and, all the stuff that you think would make people have kids, but it's just not working. So I guess now they've gone to the three-child policy, but it seems unlikely that will work either.
Yeah, although to be fair, the Chinese Communist Party really hasn't gone hard on increasing fertility. Like they have brought in cash payments and some other kind of smaller programs and stuff, but they haven't like gone extreme, especially like, they haven't even gone beyond what, a lot of Western countries do in terms of encouraging parents to have kids. And part of the reason that they haven't done that is like, this is a weakness of the Chinese political system is like, they really have to be careful about undermining previous policy in order to not bring into question the whole like government. So they really don't want to do anything dramatic that would cause regular citizens to like question, oh, well, maybe the one-child policy was stupid from the get-go, right? So they're very hesitant to bring in dramatic shifts in policy that would look like it's undermining or critical of or in contradiction with previous policy that they've had in place.
Yeah, because the utopia has already been reached, right? The government's
and it's the same. It's the same party, right? Like in say a Western democracy, a different party can say, well, the other party is stupid. They did the wrong thing. Their policy sucks, and then they get into power. They reverse course on the policy, whatever. So in that way, like it's really easy to just like shed blame and kind of course correct in a democracy without it having like implications on like the overall parties and party system. Whereas in China, it's the same party, right? So if the party that 6 months ago says you can't have more than one child is now saying we're going to pay you a shitload of money to have kids, it's just a huge contradiction. And like, okay, why was this policy in place for 30 years? Why, like maybe central planning doesn't know what's best for us if they have such a huge course correction. So China oftentimes tries to avoid like major course corrections and harsh actions that would be contradictory to their previous policies for that very reason. They don't want the working population, they don't want the average citizen getting ideas like, oh, maybe we are fallible, maybe we are flawed and imperfect at predicting things, and our policies aren't, the best and might be completely ass backwards. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe China will eventually go really crazy in terms of encouraging births, but so far they've been careful not to.
They're easing their way into it.
Yeah, they're definitely being cautious about it, even though they might have some. They probably are starting to get a better understanding of how bad it is going to be for their country, but their political concern causes them to. It seems it has been backing them away from major action. I think that about covers it for East Asia, but can always circle back to
sounds
China.
Good. Do we want to move over to Europe?
Yeah, I think that's a good one to get onto because
sounds good.
I think before I would have definitely thought Asia was way ahead of Europe, and I mean objectively they are, but I think in a lot of ways the only big reason for that is the immigration difference. Like Europe has obviously got a lot of immigrants, and they've always been accepting of immigrants, at least since the end of the Second World War. And that has papered over a lot of their problems. So in Europe in the last 20 years, and to give a baseline in Europe, and I think most countries, the replacement rate for a stable population is 2.1 kids per female. And Europe is now at 1.5 children per woman. So not even close to 2.1. And that's buoyed by immigrants that often have like 2 to 2.5 children per immigrant female. And the local populations will often have 1 to 1.3 in that sort of ballpark. So like a quarter to a third of your births in countries like France and the Netherlands or UK that take immigrants will be foreign immigrants having births. So that does a lot to help with the demographic crunch, sort of delay it. The interesting part of Europe is the East, because Eastern Europe is very anti-immigrant. In fact, having 9 of the 10 most anti-immigrant sentiments in all countries, according to one poll. So they seem to be very anti-immigrant, and they also are shedding population like crazy because they're right next to Western and Central Europe that have higher standards of living. And that population drain is only exasperated when they eventually join the EU. So the wildest one in terms of statistics would be Latvia, which joined the EU in 1995. So in 25 years in the EU, it's lost 1/5 of its population. And then the most recent dramatic one would be Romania, which joined in 2007. And between 2009 and 2015, they lost 1/2 of their doctors and 3 million people.
What's their overall population?
I can't remember the overall population for Romania, but basically half of their doctors has put their medical system into the verge of collapse. And Romania is expected to continue shedding population, like pretty much the worst in all of Europe.
Yeah, they got 20 million, so 3 million. That's a pretty sizable chunk.
6%?
Yeah, and they've definitely been declining.
Oh, no, sorry, 15%. Yeah, that would be...
Roughly 15. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's just terrifying. Croatia has also just been chunked. They lost 230,000 people out of a population of 4 million. So this is a common theme in Eastern Europe. The one sort of, you could, if you're optimistic, you could say the saving grace for Eastern Europe is that as they've lost these populations in the EU, they've had a lot of blowback against the EU, but if they stay in the EU, which it looks like most of them will do for the foreseeable future, there is a trend that's beginning to occur of purchasing power parity, which is a way of evaluating how far your money goes in a given country. The best countries to be in the EU are Eastern European. So the highest net incomes in the EU are often in Eastern Europe. So there is beginning to be a sort of return by some professionals towards Eastern Europe because they want to be back in their home country and they want to be with their family. And it's still in the EU, so it's not hard to go back. So there's a light of hope for Eastern Europe to not continue to be ravaged at the rate that they have been by deporting to the West. But at the same time, for every person that leaves the West, they're not being replaced because the West they've been taking immigrants from abroad outside of the EU, but the EU is their biggest source of fast immigrants with higher education. So if they leave the West and to go to the East, it deprives the West of needed workers, and the East has already been deprived of those workers. So it's not a good overall prognosis for the EU, but it seems very difficult to make a prediction on any given country and how it's going to shake up because there's so much freedom of movement and the incentive structures that will be at play for which countries people will go to. And then there's Russia, and Russia is just in a terrible state. They have about the same fertility as the average European country, around like 1.5, but their life expectancy is dramatically lower than any comparable country. They are looking like, if you compare them to similar countries in terms of life expectancy, they're in Africa or South America, much below an industrialized modern nation. With men, I think the current life expectancy is 60 years for males. And they had, what I saw for excess mortality last year, like 1.5 million deaths from COVID. And they were already not growing. And now they've embroiled themselves in a war in the Ukraine, which will cost them even more young men. So that country's demographic crisis is going to hit probably like no other.
Well,
and then there's the unfortunate
question here. If they have a lower life expectancy for like the elderly, wouldn't that then alleviate some of the pressures of like having that inverted pyramid?
It would alleviate the social safety net sort of pressures and like medical system. But then again, a place like Russia doesn't have, that's one of the reasons they don't have the high life expectancy, because they don't have those in place to begin with. So yes, it would make it not as bad as we're going to see in Western countries, where you're going to have a lot of reticence to stop supporting. Well, the baby boomers are going to be a huge cohort that argues that they need every single piece of life-saving care and millions of dollars pumped into each individual to keep them alive until they're 111 on an IV drip with VR goggles on. But like Russia just won't have people. The prognosis for Russia that I've seen is they'll lose 20% of their population by 2050.
Jesus.
So they'll go from 140 million people to about 110.
Well, just to add
20
to
years
what,
from now, that is not a lot of time. That was like 2080, but you're a couple of decades ain't that long when you really think about it.
well, like Con was saying that, like that it might help their social safety net with declining or like with low life expectancies. Although part of the problem in Russia, as far as I understand it, is they have a lot of deaths among like young and middle-aged men.
Yeah,
which would be like,
that's true as well.
Like it's not just like people hit 60 and then they die because they're whatever. There's no social safety net. It's like a lot of times it's 20-year-old men that are dying of drug overdoses or in crime or whatever.
Well, AIDS too is a big one in Russia, and then alcoholism really starts to kick in with like cirrhosis of the liver and stuff around 50.
Yeah, and that's
pretty
failure.
productive and contributing to the society. If you get taken out at 50, it's like a big
and also if you're
70.
hard drinking to the point you die at 50 from cirrhosis of the liver, your productivity might not be as high.
That's true.
Like you might not be the most productive factory worker so I think that is going to be that'll be a complication for them regardless, just because it will be hitting younger and middle-aged men as well, not just the older people.
There's sort of, I don't even want to say it, I've never seen like a professional take on this, but like in the general internet milieu, there's sort of a feeling that this is kind of Russia's death throw, is the war in Ukraine. Like, they've got nothing. Like, the country has no prospects. Like, it's sort of Putin's attempt to roll the dice and do something other than just die, like, whimpering as a country. Fade into nothingness.
I can actually add, I believe that in, I have actually seen some of that in official, I don't know what you call it, expert takes, is that part of the Ukrainian war was Putin's, is kind of trying to save Russia essentially because they have such bleak prospects for the next 20 or 30 years. And he knew this was kind of like the time to roll the dice because it's only going to get worse from here. And, adding Ukraine and say Belarus to their quote unquote empire would have been actually pretty good for demographics. Ukraine's, I think, in a better situation than Russia for population. It might be wrong, but I think they are. I think they're younger.
I was going to go into, like, they've had incredible displacement, and it's going to be a disaster for their demographics if the war drags on.
But pre-war, I guess, would be the assessment, right? Like, Putin was thinking, if we can scoop in here, get in here, topple the Zelensky government, and add Ukraine to our empire, then, we got this 40 million more people that might help stave off some of the worst of our demographic declines, right?
Yeah.
It didn't work out for him with the war, but I think that was, I have seen actual credible sources posit that as a possibility.
And with the Ukraine, they've lost 5 million refugees already from their country of about 40 million. And that's almost entirely women and children, because any men between the ages of, I think, 18 and 60 have to stay. And that has been, if you want to look on the potential upside for, how would you call it, Machiavellian or heartless politics, that could be a big boon for all of the Eastern European countries that are in the throes of a demographic crisis, especially Poland, because that is hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of new young people potentially entering your country. But that's about the only upside to it, because you're going to have a huge amount of problems in Ukraine with lowered fertility, because people aren't going to have kids in this situation, especially if it drags on, and they're all displaced from their homes. And then there's the lack of food. That food insecurity is definitely going to encourage people not to have kids. So,
pretty bleak.
Yeah, like the Eastern Europe is, I didn't realize in how bad of a state Eastern Europe was. It's kind of hard to really fathom. All the 10 countries projected by the UN, so I mean, they're working off China's official data, so I'm not sure how that plays into it. But the 10 countries projected to decline the most in population in the next 20 years are all Eastern European.
Is there any other points on Europe that we should get in before we move on to...
The easiest one to visualize that I found was that in the last 20 years, Europe has went from having 4 workers for every retiree to having 3 workers for every retiree. And by 2050, they expect that to be 2 workers for every retiree. And I mean, that's a pretty easy to visualize picture of the way Europe's headed.
What's a healthy
Well,
number?
that should...
Like, what would be considered a healthy number in that, like, for that ratio? Is there, like, is there
I mean, I would think
one?
3 to 4 probably, because Europe seems like right now, Europe seems to be a fairly healthy economy, not like growing like crazy or anything, but like steady as she goes, healthy. Like, then that's 3 to 4.
And then as you dip below that, it's probably going to start causing real problems.
I think that's where you get into automation, right? And a place like China where it's industrial, you're going to need more workers because you need more labor. Whereas in a place like Europe, we're much more service industry focused, you can probably get away with less. But automation is the one thing that everyone keeps thinking will save this sort of thing, because if one person can do the work of 4 people, then maybe you can get by with one working age person for every retiree.
It's going to be, I think that number is always going to be like context dependent, right? How productive is that labor?
Yeah.
But you also have to ask yourself, like, what is a society like that? Because if you're just thinking like working age is going to be, I think they define it depending where, but like 18 to 65 essentially, right?
Yeah,
and
basically.
Like, what does a society look like that for every 2 people 18 to 65, there's 1 person 65 or older? You know, like that goes beyond just like the economics, which I mean, the economics is a huge part, but it's like you literally just have, you know, there's a concept in like the aged population. Like this came up when I was looking at South Korea. South Korea is officially an aged population, which means 14% or more of your population is 65 plus, and they're expected to hit super age by 2025, which is 20% 65 plus. Well, like some of these countries are probably going to hit 25-30% of their population 65 and plus at some point. That beyond just like the economics of that, like what does that mean for a young person living in a society where, you know, voting, like policy is going to be largely determined by 65-year-old and older people. So a bunch of policy is going to be determined by that age group. A bunch of just amenities. Like yeah, except for it'll be, yeah, and you know, amenities and stuff. So it's not, I think, yeah, that like it goes beyond just like the economic health of the society. It goes to like just general day-to-day life in a society where, say, 30% of the people are 65 or older. I don't know.
Yeah. And another interesting sort of visual for that is over the 100 centenarian, there's currently around 100,000 in Europe, and I think by 2050 there'll be over 500,000. That's a lot of old people.
That's a lot of really old people.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that.
Like that, yeah, I don't know. Like that's pretty crazy.
Especially like thinking more about what you said there, Hubbard. You have to put yourselves in the shoes of like a young person where basically everything is going to be dictated by people who are your grandparents. And
it's going to be like the elves in Tolkien.
Yeah, you're going to be in a state where, you know, rebellion is not even an option at some point, because it's just like you're actually being outvoted. Like,
well, people are going to go through the rebellious phase at like 50. It's like
young whippersnappers, 50-year-olds.
Oh, those damn 50-year-olds, fucking them and their young young attitudes. They'll see when they, you know, hit retirement age what life's really like. But I think the other part of that equation too that people don't think about is like family structure. When your median family, you know, obviously China being a good example, your median family size is 1 child. Like that's your most common situation is a single child. You know, if you have that for a couple generations, your family's going to be tiny in terms of like the number of, you know, cousins, cousins and in-laws and that kind of thing. Like you're just not going to have very many relatives, and most of your relatives that you do have, it's going to be like generational. So you're going to have like, you know, great grandparents and grandparents. That's going to be like most of your family is going to be people that is way older than you, a generation above you. You're going to have very few peer family. You're not going to have siblings. You're not going to have cousins. Like none of this is going to exist, which is going to be very, I think, that's also like completely unique in human history, because throughout human history you would have a family as big as you pretty much could.
Yeah. Oh, speaking of that, Ireland, I don't think people realize this because it's the youngest state in Europe, but it is apparently projected to never get back to the population it had during the potato famine. It'll never recover in terms of population density, which is crazy to me. That was a weird factoid.
Yeah, that is.
Yeah, that
Well,
is.
that was what in the.
1840.
Yeah, I was gonna say like somewhere in the mid 1800s. So.
Like it declined from 1840 until like 1960, and then it had a big recovery, and it's never projected to recover to 1840 levels.
That's truly crazy.
I mean, to be fair, like obviously a huge chunk of that is immigration, right? So
Yeah,
like you'll have like scattered. It's a bit weird. Like there's Irish all over the globe now, right? So
that'd be like the big thing is they were an incredibly populous place, and then they had the population crunch with food crunch, and a ton of them left. That's why there's so many. But it makes sense, I guess. That's why there's so many everywhere, because at the time that was an enormous population.
Yeah, and North America
all over the world.
There's tons of. So many landed in Canada and the U.S.
Oh yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Huge chunk of Irish descendant.
We got a lot of that in this family.
Do we want to go to North America, or do we have any last thoughts on Europe?
And that could almost have been seen as a segue. It's something we don't do often.
Too hard.
Okay, so Canada, I just took a look at Canada and America as that was, I think, the more relevant to those who listen to the podcast, if anybody does. And Canada and the US are actually in a rather unique situation comparatively to a lot of other countries like East Asia and Europe. And what makes these places a fair bit different is we don't really have like a inverted pyramid going on. So after World War II, we had all the GIs come back. And when they came back, there was the big baby boom, and that's the generation known as the boomers. And then the boomers had a whole bunch of kids as well. So we actually have like a really big cohort that are in the roughly like the 50 group to about the 70 group almost. Like there's a very big population bulge in there. And then below that, you have the Gen X, which is pretty small. But then the millennial group is actually a huge generation. So we have a very large group of people that are in their really hitting their economic productivity years, and as well as their consuming years. So for these two nations, like it's looking a lot better in that sense. But when you do get down to Gen Z, there's way less. So it is starting to follow the same trends as other places.
So what you're saying is millennials ruined demographic collapse?
Yes, pretty much. They ruined
goddamn millennials.
They didn't do demographic collapse right.
They're just being
Tragic
hipsters about it.
millennials.
Just got to be contrarians.
To be fair though, did you look in? You said that baby boomers huge, Gen X small, obviously because Gen X, and then millennials pretty big because they're the baby boomers' kids. Presumably, the Gen Z, the Zoomers, are going to be Gen X kids, so they're going to be small because the Gen X was small. But did you look into any like evidence or research on how big the next generation, the millennial kids' generation, are going to be? Because the millennial
follow the same patterns as the rest of the developed world. Because Canada and America's birth rate, Canada's birth rate's at Europe's birth rate. It's 1.5, and America's, I think, is slightly higher. I can't remember the exact number. Being dumb, I didn't write it down, but it's not much better.
It has to be said, millennials are going to have a lot of kids, but have you thought that those kids are not going to be of the human species?
It's just a lot of fucking cats and dogs.
Is that a? Yeah, I was gonna say, is that a reference to pets as kids?
Yeah,
Yes,
everyone's calling their pets kids
that
these days in the
tilts me.
millennial age group.
That tilts me so hard. They call them fur babies, and anytime somebody does that, it makes me want to retch. It's just like, it's not a child. It's just, stop it. But like Canada and America, they're both in a bit of that. We're still in a pickle. Like we're definitely looking a fair bit better than, especially like East Asia and Europe. And one of the things about Canada that actually makes us rather unique is we have an insane amount of immigration. Like we are the most, by proportion, we take the most immigrants in the entire world. We're taking 1.1% of our population every year, and we usually try to fill them, like a big chunk of that, through like 20 somethings. So, you know, a lot of people do complain about immigration, but it is something that actually really does forestall this problem. Though, looking at like just to take Canada's like numbers, we still have roughly 20% almost of people who are above retirement age. So we are still like in a pretty heavy aging population. We do have that nice millennial generation. Nice might not be the greatest word, but we do have that millennial generation that will forestall the problems for a while. But just like all of the indicators are, like the millennial generation is not going to have kids at nearly the same level as like the boomers did. It's just not. That's not, like, Canada is not special in that sense, nor is America. But because we have that, like, I think it looks like we're kind of it'll stall out the problem for like 30 years comparatively to, you know, Japan's like now really starting to hit that problem. Same with China. But when I was looking into like Canada's immigration policies, because, you know, like it is starting, like, you know, like the immigration does forestall that, but Canada does take half the immigrants as like economic ones, but another chunk of them are, like, another pretty big chunk are family sponsors. So that's 25% of all immigrants are family sponsors, and a lot of those are going to be grandparents and parents. And so, like, even if we are like fleshing out the ranks pretty hard, just with raw numbers, it does seem to be like a decent subset of that is going to be people probably who are not going to be productive. Just, you know, like if you're bringing in your parents and you're 40 and you bring in your grandparents as well, it's like neither of those groups are going to contribute a ton. So while we do have quite a bit of more of a stopgap comparatively to other countries, like even compared to the US, it might, like by raw numbers, it might not still be as effective as one might think. But given the fact that like Gen Z is tiny, and given the fact that the basic pattern is going to hold true with millennials and with Gen Z as well, it is from all research, like we're gonna still run into the same problem. It's just going to be 20-30 years delayed comparatively. Now, that might actually give these like USA and Canada some time for technology to maybe alleviate some of the burden, but who knows, right? Like
Tesla bots.
Yeah. Elon,
well, I think that for Canada, we have obviously legal immigration. That's a huge chunk of it. And then the States has illegal immigration. I mean, they have plenty enough legal immigration in the U.S. as well, but like that is another part of the equation in the U.S. where there's a good chunk of illegal immigrants, and most of them are young, and they actually usually have families and
yes, but
a good number of kids, the higher birth rates.
Is when like the next generation, so like those, I looked into that as well. So the second generation, like so the kids born to the immigrants, they follow the same patterns in terms of way smaller family sizes. Like just their general fertility rates pretty much line up with the natives, quote unquote natives, of that country, whether it be Canada, like, so natives meaning like born in the nation, right? So basically, like, unless you just carry on with like mass immigration indefinitely, you like Canada and America are going to follow the same pattern. And just to kind of point out, it's all nations are going to hit this problem. And so where are you going to pull the immigrants from? Probably nowhere at some point. Once every nation starts experiencing this at some point, unless something else happens where fertility rates go up a lot, it's just kicking the can down the road, because you're not going to be able to pull, like, let's just, because Africa will top out, like that would be the last probably bastion where there's going to be a really big surplus of people to pull from in terms of immigration. But once they hit that, they're like, and they start like declining, you're not going to have anywhere to pull from, especially since once countries recognize like, oh shit, this is a huge problem, you're not immigrating elsewhere. Like countries
That's
might
something
start pull back on that, like even allowing people to immigrate elsewhere. So
I forgot to mention that in Europe, in Eastern Europe, there's about 5 or 6 countries that are seriously considering immigration controls.
just like
Like
banning
you're
their citizens.
not allowed to leave the country. The problem, obviously, they would run into if they actually tried to go forward with it is being part of the EU. But the populace wants it. Like it's popular with the voters.
I mean, I do see it as like, obviously you are kicking the can down the road, but like you're kicking it pretty fucking far when it comes to like human timescales.
Yeah, that's the saving
Like
grace for Canada and America, is like you are kicking it down far enough
30,
that there might
40,
actually
50,
be,
70, 100 years. That's a long freaking
yeah,
time
like
for
it definitely
things to
is
change.
looking like, and I was listening to the Sam Harris podcast, and that was one of the things that the demographic expert was talking about. Canada and the States are in a good enough situation that we're probably going to be able to ride this out, and given changes in technology and like different, like just like the rate of change, the experts were pretty confident that it'll be all right for Canada and the States, like just because we do have that huge millennial cohort to carry us all the way for the next, well, probably 30 years for sure, and probably even up to 40 or so. And given that, it's, 2060, in 40 years, like hopefully enough can change that we'll be able to have some better solutions to it. So the future for Canada and America is like our futures in terms of demographic collapse are not nearly as bad as the rest of like the areas that we have covered. And it does look good enough that we probably will be able to sort it out, which is great being from one of those countries.
Well, do you have any further details on North America, or should we just kind of like go into implications or more general thoughts?
That's about it. Just because it's only the two countries and they're pretty similar. Like there is a little bit more. Like one of the just to kind of like note one of the reasons why this like Canada and the States, but the States in particular, the reasons we're not having the same problems is like our urbanization process has been very like slow. It's been multiple generations. This more applies to the States particularly, but Canada I think follows it fairly well as well. I do think that it's not quite the same, and Canada's made up for it through its immigration policies. Just because we take more proportionally than the States does by quite a big margin. Like just to put those in perspective, lawfully there's about 1 million immigrants that are turned into permanent residents in the States per year. Canada's 400,000, and the States is almost 10 times our population. So like it proportionally, Canada takes far more. So I do think that Canada's like these factors that I'm going to discuss don't apply quite as much to Canada, but from what I could tell, we do make up for it through our immigration policies. But basically, Canada, America had generations to kind of adapt to urbanization. So whereas like China and Japan, but particularly China, like they did it in one generation. So like everybody kind of like moved from being subsistence farmers into the cities within like one generation, like starting in roughly the 70s, 80s. And then, but in Canada and the States, we had generations to do that. And basically, when you have more space, cost of living, cost of raising kids is lower. It's a bit easier. So you don't have like such a rapid decline in terms of like the amount of kids that you're having. Plus we had the big GI boom. And those two things together just allowed for Canada and the States to have like a bit more of a, like it wasn't such a rapid flipping of the pyramid. You are starting obviously to see that with like Gen Z and the millennials kids will come next. But because of this like slower process with more like, you know, people living out in the suburbs and whatnot, where you could buy a home for a couple $100K and you could have multiple kids. It wasn't quite as like, you know, you're not moving into a condo downtown Shanghai and, you know, looking at like raising 3 kids. Obviously the one child policies, like, you know, if you remove that, you know, if you're living in, let's say, better example, like Tokyo, you're living in a 1-bedroom tiny apartment in a 100-story tower in Tokyo, you know, 3 kids is probably not looking too appealing. So that lower cost of living, just due to the slower urbanization in many ways, especially in the States, kind of led to like a much more drawn out process, which has also contributed to the two countries having like less of a problem with demographics comparatively. So it is pretty interesting. I think there's more to it than that, but that's like, I thought that was, yeah, like an interesting like cultural difference.
When you say slower urbanization, I mean, I find it a little confusing just because I'm fairly certain that Chinese cities have always been larger than American cities. It's more the industrialization that went crazy.
No, urbanization in China went absolutely insane. So if you look at like how fast the percentage change in the amount of people who were urban versus rural, it's way faster in China. They went from their increases in urbanization in terms of percentage of population living in cities increased way faster than North America or any other place.
I was just picturing cities themselves, and like the cities are bigger, but yeah, they would go from bigger to even bigger.
Well, and more cities, right?
They would be like, right now, would China not be more urban than the United States? Like the United States is remarkably rural for its size, for its development, is it not?
Yeah, it is. And that's why I think there's a difference between Canada and the US, which like if Canada didn't have the immigration that it did, we'd probably be in a much worse position than we are now, just given most of Canada's population lives in kind of like pretty decent city centers. They're tiny comparatively to the States and then minuscule compared to China. But, you know, that's just because of our population is like 38, 36, 38.
Yeah, but I don't really agree with that. I think like Canada is a lot like the US in the terms of like, I think it's not just urbanization you have to look at. You have to also look at the type of urbanization. And if you look at like, I think that's
suburbanization.
You also, yeah, and that also like explains Europe. Like if you bring Europe into it, Europe also didn't have like the huge baby boom that Canada and the US did post-war. And I think part of that is they were, you know, economically beaten to the dirt from the war, which Canada and the US, the US mostly, I think a lot of it comes back to space and economic prosperity, where the US rebuilt Europe and made a shitload of money doing it and was incredibly economically prosperous from like 1945 onward. Like they're good to go from the start. Yeah, and Canada was in a very similar situation where they weren't as industrialized, but Canada had a great resource economy and resources of big demand. And Canada's infrastructure was built up from the war and wasn't damaged from the war. So Canada had the same situation where people came home. There was economic prosperity everywhere. They had kids because they're prosperous. And the United States was the same, whereas Europe, I think you see a lot less of that because, you know, these places were suffering. Great Britain had absolute crushing national debt from the war. They had infrastructure bombed to shit. They were not doing well. They're obviously not going to have the same opportunities for people coming out of World War II that the United States did. And then you just look at like the space constraints.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just, Great Britain is like the size of one province of Canada and has twice as many people. Like they just, I think that's like a natural barrier for people having kids or just like growing, right? Like population
and it
growth
absolutely is borne out in the American data, because the best demographics in terms of like in the context of this problem is the Midwest, because they have tons of space and not that many people, so they have lots and lots of kids. I do think there are other factors at play, like religion and that type of thing, but just they have way more space, way less people, so they have like a pretty healthy demographic makeup. So they don't they're not having that same inverted pyramid problem. But then you look at California and New York, and it's just like it's really bad. Like they're looking a lot more like a place like Japan comparatively, just because they're all stacked up on top of each other. Nobody wants to raise 3 kids in a 2-bedroom condo that costs you $3,000 a month if you're living in New York, where 11 million people live. So it's just, yeah, exactly. Like the space is a huge component of that, which due to the influencing cost of living, right?
So I looked up urbanization, and I was totally out to lunch on my assumptions. China's still not at where America was in 1970, and America's continued to urbanize since then. So America right now is like 83% is urbanized, and even the Midwest is 76%, and China is only 64%.
Yeah.
So it's not even like China's not even as urbanized as the American Midwest. Although I have heard, and I believe this would influence these statistics, that in China, a lot of people legally live in cities to work because they have population controls that people skirt. So it's probably a little higher than the 64% they say, but
you always have to take Chinese statistics with a grain of salt. But China did basically go from
20% in 1980, according to this, to 64% in 2020.
Yeah, they went from an a rural society to an urban one in one-ish generation, right? Like 30
they just have so many people that even when they were rural, they had massive international cities, which skewed my perception.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, China is like, the scale of China is just pretty hard to get your mind around. Like, they are crazy.
Yeah, just look at it on Google Maps, and you're just like, how is this even possible?
Go look up like some cities that are like 10 million plus people that you've never heard the name of before.
Yeah, who heard of Wuhan before COVID, right? Like nobody even knew that was a city in China, and it's 11 million people. It's like nobody knows who that.
Yeah, there's New York-sized cities. There's like 5 or 6 New York-sized cities in China that you don't know the name of because it's not Shanghai and Beijing. And you're
exactly. And then there's tons and tons and tons of ones that are in the 5 million range that are like that, bigger than Toronto, and there's a bunch of them.
Yeah, it is an interesting country for sure.
That's it for me on North America.
Okay, well, why don't we just go into I guess we were kind of digging into, going to talk about what does it mean in terms of the demographic change. Because, we're not obviously experts on it, and so why talk about it? I think the big thing that we can talk about is what should you, as a regular person, why should you care about it? What you can, what is the implication for you, and what can you do about it? I think again, a big part of just learning about this topic is the misunderstandings it creates, where some people might think if you're a young person right now and you hear oh, well, the world's gonna have a demographic collapse, that great. I think that might be the
16-year-old me would think that.
Well, yeah, and it does intuitively make sense, right? You think, oh, well,
too many people,
especially
anyways.
Well, and in Canada, or North America, or any of these places where we're talking about that have high populations that are facing demographic declines, you might think, oh, well, like they're already highly dense populations, and a demographic decline means that less people means, more space for me, more housing for me, more everything for me. And I think to be fair, there is a bit of that going to happen. Like you're going to see, like I think I mentioned this fact earlier, housing in Japan dropped 60% and never recovered. So, if you're a Japanese young person looking for a house, well, it's actually easier to get. It's just, demographics matter, and they do impact people like that in a positive way. But I think there's some negative consequences that people don't think about because they're a little bit hidden. And I think we talked about one of them before, especially for a young person in, say, Canada. An aging population in a democracy policy is going to be oftentimes dictated by that older voting group. And if you're a young person who's working age, well, they're probably going to vote for you to get absolutely, work to the bone supporting them. Why wouldn't they? They're not going to want to.
All of a sudden, your CPP contributions are 20% of your paycheck.
Exactly. Well, yeah, you could foresee a few millennial, and your labor might be in high demand because there's not a lot of workers, but the government has decided that redistribution to old people is your primary, goal of your labor is going to be redistributing that wealth to the old voting bloc to get them reelected. Yeah, so CPP contributions are up, income taxes up, or maybe new invented taxes based on whatever they need to do to get you to pay capture as much of your productivity and give it to the people that voted them in as possible. And that might not be a deal you want to take.
But don't forget, they'll give you some tax advantage accounts to buy a house at an inflated price to transfer your wealth more to the old people too.
True. Yes. So I think that's something where, on the face of it, it might seem like an easy win for someone who is of working age. But another thing to consider, for example, is say you are one of those millennial age laborers who's going to be in high demand now. Well, companies haven't had much incentive to invest in the economy or in capital, I guess, for the last 50, 60 years because the labor pool was expanding rapidly. So the amount of capital per labor unit didn't need to be that high because they could just add more labor because it was cheap. I mean, if you do a kind of a basic analysis, when China and India joined the global economy, so to speak, and opened up their markets, that tripled the labor market globally in one shot. And that happened in like the 70s and 80s and 90s. And so that's just like one of several factors that led to a huge expansion of the labor pool over the last, say, 40, 50 years, which led to companies deciding to basically use labor instead of capital because it was plentiful. Now that labor is going to be a constraint, they might decide to invest in capital. And that could mean a lot of money going into automation, which could mean if you're a low-skilled worker, you're going to be competing against robots, which you're going to eventually lose that competition, and you might not have a job whatsoever. So it might be good in the transitional period where your labor is scarce and in demand, but it might force companies into making decisions like automating everything where, after the 5-year transitional period and they put a couple $1 trillion into automation infrastructure, you're completely redundant. So, that's something where
and I would like to kind of point out as well, so I'm like a skilled knowledge worker. And so a lot of people think, you can't really replace those jobs. There's so many little things, like there are so many things that I do in my job that it's like, this is definitely routine. And like if I was intelligent enough and a coder, I could write something to just do this for me. and I could remove 30 to 40% of my job. And I went to school for 4 years for it, and I also then went and like spent like like a post bachelor education as well, like basically like a master's. And there's a ton of stuff that can be automated. So it's like it's not just like the service worker down at McDonald's. There's a lot of stuff that can be automated, and if somebody's going to chuck $1 trillion into automating my job, it's going to happen. Like they'll figure that out. And so for those that might listen to this that are think that your job's protected, well, unless you're a plumber or something like that, probably not. Like there's a lot of stuff that can be automated away. And like I said, looking at like a big chunk of what I do, it's like I can see just what I would need to do to actually automate it. And if I was a coder, I probably already could have. And so like right now I think it's just still kind of cheaper, like within my industry, just for them to keep plugging away doing it at the same thing, like the same way that they've been doing it for quite a long time. But I do know, like, my company has the sight set on getting rid of a huge chunk of this, like absolutely. So like this is not going to just be the people who are only low skilled labor. Like this is it. If trillions of dollars are flooding into that and into automation, it's going to impact pretty much every industry except for like the high dexterity type work like trades.
I think a huge thing for the intelligent sort of job market is if they get a version of generalized AI working to the point where it doesn't become a huge investment in a specific program to do your job, but your company can just pay an AI company that will just sick its AI on it and learn the job in like half a year or a year of, I don't know, monitoring what the real humans are doing. And then it can just, okay, now we can do it. And it only costs us $100,000, $1 million, $10 million.
Yeah. Then everybody's pretty much out of a job at that stage.
That's like that's the dream that the super pro AI people have.
Well, and I think that, interestingly enough, like that future is more likely because of the demographic problem, because companies are going, okay, well, we have this huge, labor shortage essentially. Are we gonna, go pay a bunch more for labor? Now the opportunity cost is much higher, and they're willing to spend more on capital. Or they might not even be able to
fill it, right? Like
some industries. Some industries are going to be like that, where they can't fill it at all, or they just have to, compromise or whatever, right? And the more of those decisions that pile up in favor of spending money on capital investment into automation, the more you're going to see different jobs. And I mean, obviously, you're 100% right, Con, where there are a lot of what we consider high skilled jobs that are going to get automated away. I mean, I think those are, the higher skilled your job, generally the longer it's going to take, obviously. So I think that's why most people focus on the low skill jobs, because they're going to be the first to go. It's going to be like the leading indicator, and it's going to be like the test case in a lot of scenarios. There is, I think, there's going to be interesting little niche skill jobs that are easy to automate, or like kind of low hanging fruit for automation. And I think one of the ones that we've already seen this happen to is, what is it called? Like radiology. Where AI is actually currently essentially better than humans at reading medical scans.
Yeah, people are bailing out of that industry.
And exactly, like they can't, like nobody is specialized. No doctors are specializing in radiology pretty much, because it's already seen as like a dead end career path. And I think that will be an interesting, like we'll have these little microcosms of automation in highly skilled areas that will kind of, I think they'll be, once they do happen, I think it'll put some notice, some fear into people about their skilled job, when it's like, oh, well, that was a, high paid, high skilled, very specialized job that just went away. But but yeah, so I think bringing it back to the point, like those are the unintended consequences that I think you need, like the second and third order consequences that you need to be aware of when you're thinking about this, and like thinking about what government should do in response and what you want your government to do. Because if you were to take it at face value and you are a millennial kind of age person, you think, oh great, demographic collapse, good, I can finally buy my house. Well, maybe that's true, but there might be some other consequences that you didn't think of that are far worse than high housing costs, right? So it is worth giving it a deeper look than just the surface level, for sure.
And the other,
I heard the most dystopian thing looking into this, and it was basically there's this idea in the sort of communist sections of the internet, I don't know about academia, where once everything's automated, the government should still provide a job for every single person, even if the job is completely meaningless and useless.
yeah,
I'm
that
like,
won't
this
lead to
sounds
people
like
wanting to
the
shoot
end of the
themselves.
world. like this is the worst solution I've ever heard to the problem of automation, is like just keep people working even though they're now redundant.
Yeah, I cannot imagine anybody not going truly insane from that. Like, make
Like
work
that-
so bad.
Yeah, like
You-
if we
because
get the
you need
magic
to, like,
automation
especially,
that
I would say,
saves
for-
us.
Well, like, especially for men, I would say it's like, I think a lot of value that people derive and that they derive in life comes from their work. It's not everything. I think you'd have to be kind of mentally deranged to think that your entire value as a human comes from work. But you need a real purpose. And if you know that your job is just meaningless and you're doing it just to be occupied, it's like, I can't imagine there being it would just be a mental health crisis beyond like mental health crisis that I think it would
Yeah, I
just
mean,
be
it's my
just like completely destructive to the society.
it's my opinion that a big problem in our current society is that so many jobs don't have like a true deeper meaning. You're just serving other people, like
I
you're
see that
serving
in
them
my own-
Starbucks or McDonald's or whatever.
Like as a knowledge worker, like myself, I see that like it affects me pretty completely because I look at my job, and yes, what I do in many ways is useful to the economy, but it's so abstract and also riven with bullshit that it's so hard to get yourself to do any work in the morning because you're just that it's like this at the end of the day I could not do anything and it really wouldn't change the outcomes whatsoever. Like it just wouldn't change what happened in terms of like the goals I'm trying to achieve with this job. Like things would just truck on as they would normally do, even if I just pretty much put a whole bunch of pictures of dick butt into the files and just left it. Like it just wouldn't really make that much of a difference. And I couldn't imagine like a job where it truly from the absolute start that it is just a pointless make work thing. Like I think that would just be
Like in my
so
mind,
demoralizing.
like I would almost view this the opposite way, where I'd be somewhat hopeful that with the lack of workers available, that people will actually be tasked with more meaningful tasks because there aren't excess workers to go around.
Yeah,
But that's kind of the optimistic take.
That would be like the optimistic thing where it's like you don't have as many workers, and so all of those workers are like put into useful roles, and the automation takes over the stuff that people don't want to do. But that's a real optimistic view of it because I just don't think there's going to be that nice fit. I can't imagine that the Cosmos roll of the die turning out such that that's the case. It just doesn't happen that way, at least in my opinion.
Well, it's almost always going to be somewhere between the pessimistic and optimistic. Just the odds.
Yeah, it is interesting that as we have a demographic kind of collapse, there is the talk of automation. It is almost a bit too perfect of a fit. You had people ringing the bell about automation is going to destroy the the labor market as we know it, and then people saying, well, the labor market, there's not going to be any labor left. So,
Yeah.
oh wow, problem solved. But I think, I think people should focus on like what kind of a country they want to live in, like what kind of a world they want to live in, and if you, I think automation will play a big role because that will, in part, determine like how big of a deal this is economically. Like how well we can get automation going will, impact the economics of it. But I think you have like two different models essentially already. You have like I think Canada is actually like a prototypical like pro immigration country. Like we immigrate, like Colin was saying, the most per capita in the whole world, basically for the last while, and that's filling the demographic gap to an extent. It's delaying the economic consequences of this. But on the other hand, you have all the problems that come along with immigration. And then on the other side, you have Japan, who is just as far along this path in terms of like birth rate declines and the demographic inversion and all this stuff. And they're still very anti-immigration. They still have tiny immigration levels. They bring in a certain amount of workers on like temporary basis, but it's, they don't let them stay, and it's very minimal. And there is like some tiny bits of increase in immigration in Japan starting, it seems. But they've by and large decided to just ride it out. And that's actually, interestingly enough, that seems like the farther along this path you are, the more likely you are to utilize robots in your economy. There's actually research done on that. So they seem to be just naturally going towards the only other alternative, essentially, which is automation. And I don't think there's nothing that's saying like the Canadian model or the Japanese model is better. It just depends what you want. And there is uncertainty around how well automation will eventually work. So you're gambling. You're gambling either way, right? Like in Japan's case, they're gambling that automation will be, or technological innovation in general, essentially will save them and come to the rescue, and they'll be able to support their rapidly aging population with huge increases in per worker productivity over the next couple of decades. And Canada's in a similar vein, rolling the dice on, being able to continue to integrate, 1% of our entire population per year in terms of immigration. And we've seen some cracks in that system as well. So it's there's definitely risks.
I want to point out some cracks there. It's like when you are rapidly changing the makeup of your country, like that is going to have a pretty significant impact on the population that was, that has been there for a while. And so it's not something that, you can just do without any problems arising. Like there's a lot of different problems with it, and especially you look to Europe, and they're really struggling to integrate. And if you're rapidly doing that, there are consequences to that as well. And those are things that you can't just sweep under the rug, right? Like you do have to look at that as, and in an objective manner as possible, because doing this podcast research really did open my eyes to if Canada hadn't been doing this, we might be in a bit more of a problem than in a problem that might have actually been significant enough to really screw us over in the next 20 years, right? And so, there really are two sides to this coin, and both of them are quite different. So I think, basically, like Hubbard's was saying, is you are going to have to look at this as objectively as you can and determine okay, what option makes more sense to me, and what type of country do I think is like the, just the better style of handling it. And then, look to the people who are actually putting those options out there.
I think one interesting thing, especially given like how people think of Canada, is that I've never really seen it be a political issue or even something that's brought up as to whether or not Canada should be importing all these people. I mean, I guess like 1% of our population is a lot as Canadians, but it's not a lot as the world. But Canada is a value-based immigration, so we take the best and brightest if we can get them. Like Canada's healthcare system would be in
of our immigration is based on that. So like that actually is that's like, if you're going to do like mass immigration like Canada is, you really need to lean into that, because otherwise you're going to wind up, though Canada is slowly, from what I could tell, moving more and more towards like bringing in families of those people who have come in before. And a lot of the time it's going to be dependent children or grandparents and parents. You don't get to bring in like your sisters, brothers, unless you don't have, like, you can bring in uncles, aunts, nieces, sisters, brothers, if you have no parents or grandparents or dependent children. But most people do, so they're going to bring in those, and like the larger majority of those are likely going to be, especially if you're bringing in like 20s and 30s, like age people, it's mostly going to be their parents and grandparents, right? So
what I wanted to get at was, like, it works with Canada, and we can ignore the aspect that we're taking the best and brightest from another country. But if a bunch of countries, or even the majority of countries facing this sort of demographic problem, tried to do that, like even China alone, if it decided to try and emulate Canada, 1% of China is what? 10 million people a year?
Yeah, but just suck up all
10, 13 million.
It's like you would immediately have, like, if it managed to accomplish it, you'd have incredible brain drain on the rest of the world. Like you would, like there'd be a Romania every year, like losing half their doctors.
Yeah, exactly.
Like in Canada's case, we wouldn't have a very functional healthcare system outside of our major cities if it wasn't for South African doctors coming to Canada, because we incentivize it so much. But like that can't be good for South Africa, even with how small Canada is.
Oh yeah, because like a big chunk of my doctors when I lived up north, they were South African. Like, statistically, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's just like it's not good for, like, there is an ethical question to bringing in the immigration to fill your gaps that I feel like isn't really asked.
Yeah,
like it's just kind of assumed immigration is like an ethical good, like absolute ethical good. It seems like in most discussions.
Yeah, that's a very good point, because what you are doing is depriving that nation of their own resources, and some of them extremely important, and you are kind of saying, well, we need them more, and we can pay more, so tough. We can provide them a better life, so you're kind of stuck without it. So,
like, the best argument I've seen, like, for that is when it's the case of absolute geniuses that say could do twice as much if they're in America, or 10 times as much if they're in America as if they're in their home country, and then that filters back to the rest of the world. But if you're talking like rare. A nurse or any healthcare worker, really, for that matter, everywhere in the world needs healthcare workers, and Canada's taking as many as we can get.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, like, that's also like a question of freedom of choice, right? Like,
yeah, that's true.
If Canadians can put the offer out to immigrants, they don't have to take it. Like, there's nothing forcing them to. They're free to choose, and I think so. I mean, I do think price, that is an interesting point, because it's not talked about as like, should we even give them that offer if we are depriving another country of their resource? But there's also the counterpoint of like, well, it's their choice. Like, and I mean, that's a big, I guess, ethical value in Western society as well, is like giving people free choice and letting them decide what's best for themselves. I think beyond like the immigration question, or beyond like, you might be stuck in a country that shows a policy and you don't agree with it or whatever, but you can have individual like decision making that takes this information into account as well. It's like, you don't have to live in your country's most populated city. You don't have to, especially if you're in Canada or the US, there's like lots of space. There's lots of areas that are low population density that you can move to, low cost of living. Like the US Midwest is a great example.
That's what
the housing is way cheaper. Often the taxes are lower. There's all sorts of things about it is cheaper. And if you want to have kids, as your choice, then bam, there you go. Like that, you don't have to wait for the government to do something or change the policy or whatever. It's like
you can just pick up, and that is exactly what I did. Like I picked up from a city that was just outrageously expensive and went to one that wasn't, and like literally on that train now, and could purchase a house because it was completely affordable for somebody in my position. Now granted, like if you are like as I said, like I am a knowledge worker, so I do make more than the average Canadian, but there are parts of the place that I moved to that are completely still within like affordability range of like even people that are around the kind of like the median income as like a couple. And I have to agree with that. It's like, if you are struggling to make the amount of money required to have a bigger property and so you can have kids in a comfortable home, like you're not raising 2-3 kids in a 2-bedroom condo. Well, it's a tough thing to pick up and move, but it's completely doable. And there's lots of great cities out there that are,
well, it is tough.
New York, but they are still completely great places to live. It is tough though.
I do think it's tough, quote unquote. Like I think it's ironic that probably a lot of people in, say, Canada, the US, are descended from people that like took, pennies and a fucking suitcase, a steamer trunk, and got on a boat and landed in, some unknown land across the ocean and made a life.
Yeah, exactly. Couldn't speak the language.
Couldn't speak the language, didn't know what the hell was going on, and just found a plot of
land,
some dirt shit, tree-covered, rock-ridden hellhole, and they don't know how to farm for shit, or they, like what are they? Well, that's a story of so many like North American families. Is like it was just like your grandparent or your great grandparent or your great great grandparent decided like, oh, I could actually maybe have a life more worth living in this. They were facing a lot of the same pressures in Europe at that time that say people in Canada or Japan are facing now, where it's like dense populations, cramped cities, high cost of living, and they moved across the ocean and made a life for themselves. And they did take a maybe a quality of life hit, like living on a homestead in middle of nowhere Canada is probably a lot harder than living in some village in England that they came from or whatever it was. So they did take a huge change in lifestyle and in probably in many respects a downgrade in lifestyle, but they did it to have that opportunity. So if you are sitting around stomping your feet and saying like, oh, I can't afford a house because my government is bringing in a bunch of immigrants and they're not doing a smart policy on housing,
affordable housing for me.
Yeah, blah blah blah. Like they're not doing the things that I want them to do to make things affordable. It's like we have the option. Instead of packing up and going across the country, across the ocean to some foreign land, you can literally go 500 kilometers north, probably in almost every instance, and find somewhere way cheaper and way more affordable. And yes, it is like you said, it is hard and it's a sacrifice, but it's like
exactly. But
in the relative course of human history, and like what people have chosen to do before our time, and like it's not that big of a deal. It's
Yeah,
really
no,
not.
it
Still an
isn't. It's like,
Amazon Prime delivery range. That's all that matters.
yeah,
Exactly. Like you're going to somewhere that's the same country, the same
you can sell all
language.
your shit and just order it again on Amazon, like, and get it
Exactly.
delivered to your house.
It's really not a big hit to your lifestyle.
Yeah,
It's really not a big change in the grand scheme of things. So stop. I guess yeah. Like you don't need to make excuses like that. It's a possibility for a lot of people that live in, especially North America, which has tons of areas that are affordable. Europe, I'm not as familiar, and I would say
When I
probably
was looking
less
into
Canadian,
Europe,
but
it does seem like there's still a trend of people to move from rural areas to cities to the point where rural areas are still depopulating and cities are still populating in the face of like the overall demographic problems. Like, or in other words, you could still move to the rural areas in most European countries. And especially for Eastern Europe, that's one of the reasons a lot of people are returning to Eastern Europe is for exactly those reasons. So much cheaper to live.
yeah, and I think so that's like one thing like for people to keep in mind is like in the face of this, like you can go and live a totally different lifestyle than what your maybe your average peer is doing, but you don't have to follow their footsteps. I think the other thing too is what was I gonna drill down on next, but like yeah, so I think that's actionable advice. Like you can vote for the path you want, but if that doesn't work out, you have individual agency and make a change that way.
yeah, and it's not going to be the simplest thing that you've ever done, but it's certainly not difficult to the point where it's just impossible. Like, you can figure it out. It'll take a little bit of time. Gotta take a little bit of money as well just to sort it all out, but it's completely doable. It really is. You know, there's a ton of people that did it over the last little while in Canada where they were they were moving into places that were cheaper just because of, Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal just hit extraordinary levels in terms of the housing costs, and people were sick of it, so they left. So, yeah, I did it, and I highly recommend it.
Yeah, and I think that also goes to like jobs as well. I would say like it doesn't take a like I think you can safely predict like not everything is gonna work out the way we predict, but I think you can safely predict like the job market is going to change significantly based on like the demographic change and the responding automation. And there's just like some safe bets you can make yourself for like positioning yourself like trades jobs is a great example. Those will be in huge demand from the demographic situation, but they'll also be in huge demand because automation like is going to be that's going to be one of the hardest things to automate. So there's not really an option for companies to just invest capital and boom, electrician is now automated.
Yeah, Boston
Electrician
Dynamics are got a
robot.
long way to go till they build a electrician robot.
So like not everyone's cut out for trades, but if you are, trades is a good example. Just any sort of keeping your education up too is just gonna help you, right? Like even being able to just keep yourself in a mindset where you can learn new things because you might be in a skilled job that looks safe now but isn't 10 years from now.
Yeah,
And
you got to be adaptable. Like that's becoming very apparent. Like, even in my own job, like, things have changed over the last 3 years, and it hasn't changed a huge amount, but we actually got a piece of automation into it, and that it's a real simple one, but it's a sign of things to come. So, like, being able to look at like complement your skill sets that you could build up that would allow you to still retain a tremendous value as a employee, or if you're running your own business as like a product or service provider, like, that will keep you a lot more. It'll give you a lot more security than if you just kind of plug away at the same thing for the next 20 years. Like, the rate of change in this world is actually baffling. So being able to handle at least some changes and being somewhat adaptable is going to be a huge advantage over being pretty much inflexible. Do you guys have anything else? I think I've said everything that I want to and more.
I think that's pretty good.
Sounds good to me.
All right. Thanks all for listening. Catch you on the next one.